meeting, which I thought was all Putin. So before I go any further, let me be clear that I think Putin is a commie who murders his political opponents and throws journalists in jail, among other things. He has violated multiple international treaties, including the Budapest Memorandum, but let's take 7 seconds to look through his history through his eyes, because understanding your enemy is very important in defeating him. What was Putin's goal? This entire time, since like 1981, most people don't know this because they don't ask. A lot of experts made assumptions that this is why they don't want, Trump talking to Putin, because they don't want him to ask that question. That way they can just define the terms and keep pumping money into the neocon machine. Putin's goal is and always was to keep NATO off its borders. By US, by default, that's the US, okay? In 1991, there was an agreement that reunified Germany after they tore down this wall. During negotiations on February 9, 1990, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker told Soviet leader Gorbachev that NATO's jurisdictional forces would not move, quote, 1 inch eastward from their current position if the Soviets accepted German unification in NATO. Now, fast forward to 1994, when Clinton signed off on expanding NATO. And in 1999, Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic officially joined NATO. Russia wasn't happy and had their objections, but they actually had no leverage to negotiate because they had just collapsed as the Soviet Union. Fast forward to 2004, where Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, 2 of which share a border with Russia, also adding Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia to NATO. And Russia, again, was super ticked off about this. And they said, hold up, this is not what we agreed to. NATO didn't care. Then, in April of 2008, at the NATO summit, a bunch of leaders issued a declaration that signaled a, quote, strong support of Ukraine and Georgia to eventually join NATO. 2 more countries that border Russia, as you can see. In the Bucharest summit declaration of 2008, paragraph 23 states, quote, NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership into NATO. We agree today that these countries will become members of NATO. Okay, so Putin's even more angry and went to war in Georgia to stop the NATO membership. People forget this stuff. Then in 2010, we put missile systems, NATO, in Poland and Romania. And the Ukraine president, Yanukovych, was expressly elected on neutrality in Ukraine, which Putin was cool with. But Russia and Ukraine were simultaneously negotiating a 25-year lease in Crimea for a Russian naval base. But then in 2014, while the U.S. tried to overthrow the Ukrainian leaders, which would have potentially put the Russian base there in jeopardy, those negotiations led to Russia taking control of Crimea, because they were like, we're not going to deal with this anymore. Keep in mind, Russia had also invested heavily in natural gas in the region, and Ukraine was pumping most of it over to the EU now rather than Russia. Then you had the Minsk agreements that NATO gave autonomy to Russian-speaking bordering areas like the Donbass, the eastern side of Ukraine, and then the U.S. and Ukraine just decided not to enforce that. Then in January of 2022, Anthony Blinken, Biden's Secretary of State, tells Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov that the U.S. reserves the right to put missile systems in Ukraine. 1 month later, Russia invaded Ukraine. And raise your hand if you saw that coming. This is the part of history they don't want you to know. Also, in the first 7 days of the invasion, there were negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Russia demanded demilitarization. And what happened? Zelensky walked away from those peace talks because he wanted NATO membership. But no one had this conversation, and no one wants to talk about it, and everybody who brings it up gets shouted down. So let me ask those people shouting at me right now, what should the U.S. do if Russia or China put a military base in, say, Cuba? Again, I'm not defending Russia. Wait, hold on a sec here. Russia did put a base in Cuba during the Cold War, and guess what we did? We responded with military action. Remember the Bay of Pigs? How would you feel if China put a military base on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls or in Tijuana, Mexico? Again, not excusing what Russia's actions here, but these are important historical sentiments that we should understand, because that's how Putin is thinking if we really want to get to the bottom of peace here. And I think last week's White House meeting was the first time people really saw how potentially unreasonable Zelensky has been during this whole thing. Again, not defending Russia at all. They broke a bunch of treaties doing this. But when I say I don't like NATO, think of this. UK is part of NATO. They're putting troops in Ukraine now, or have committed to. The NATO charter says an attack on one is an attack on all. So what happens when one of those troops gets hit with a Russian mortar? Does that drag America into this war now? You see why de-escalating this is so important? I hope so. Fred Fleitz, Vice Chair of the American First Policy Institute and former Trump National Security Council Chief of Staff. Fred, can't think of a better person to talk to about this. What is your take about the fact that no one's really asked Putin what the end result is?
I think those are important points. And you may remember when Zelensky was trying to talk about 2014 and Russia invading then. Well, this really annoyed President Trump because we know that Russia invaded neighboring states during 3 or 4 successive presidencies, Bush, Obama, and Biden, but not Trump because of Trump's strength. Another reason that the Russians invaded during Biden's presidency is because of the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. The U.S. was seen as so weak. But the question you ask is, what is our ultimate goal for U.S. relations with Russia? What if we get a peace treaty that stops the war? What do we do then? The solution is, as Trump has said, we have to somehow normalize relations with with Russia. Bring Russia back into Europe, because this growing Russia-China alliance is simply so dangerous. We're pushing Russia into the arms of China in an axis that I think is going to make the world much more dangerous.
Well, I think that's actually an extremely vital point you bring up there. So, what do you think? Do you think it's like, hey, Putin, do you want us to leave, Ukraine out of NATO altogether? If that's the answer, do you think Zelensky would go for it?
There's no way to get Ukraine into NATO. We shouldn't even be talking about that. There has to be a unanimous vote. Hungary, I was just in Hungary. They will never, ever, ever allow Ukraine to get into NATO, and there are other nations who think the same way. Trump's not making a concession when he raises that. He's simply stating reality.
Right.
But, you made another point here. Ukraine is different from all these other territories. Putin is among a minority of Russians who really don't recognize Ukraine as a nation or Ukrainian nationality. This is an issue that goes back hundreds of years. The czars and the communist governments, many of them never liked Ukraine as an independent entity. And this is something that Putin is sort of obsessed with. And he wrote about this in mid-2021. He telegraphed to the Biden administration what would happen if we kept going down the road of dangling NATO membership in front of Ukraine. It was predictable.
Yeah, no, and that's the point. Real quick, 100 billion Taiwan says it's going to invest in U.S. chip involvement. This is destabilizing for China, no?
I think this was a brilliant move. Trump is making it clear that these nations want to avoid tariffs, normalize relations with the U.S. They have to invest in the U.S. Taiwan needs our support. It needs our military support. It's looking for weapons and other advanced technologies. This is something Taiwan had to do. I'm very happy this happened.
Yeah, I think, and obviously some of the chip manufacturers and the stocks are down because the whole market's down today. But I think this is a massive, massive win for American technologies. Fred Fleitz, appreciate your insight, sir.
Good to be here.
All right, coming up.